They thought he was just a poor black widower with $70. But when he stepped onto that auction block, he didn't buy a girl, he bought back a revolution. Briar Hollow scorched under the cruel summer sun. In the dusty town square, people gathered around a creaky wooden platform. Among the heat and murmuring crowd, Sheriff Denton raised his voice. Last lot of the day, 19 years old, healthy, obedient. Nora Lynn stood barefoot on the platform, face down, her cheeks swollen with a fading bruise. She didn't cry, her tears had dried long ago. In the crowd, Reuben Cassel, a 44-year-old widowed black farmer, clutched his hat. As the only black landowner in the region, he wasn't welcome here. But today, he came not for acceptance, but for something more dangerous. 25, a coarse voice called out. It was Jethro Mays, the saloon owner, his eyes gleaming with predatory lust. Reuben clenched his fists. He had 7 left, his entire savings meant for seeds this planting season. Then someone shouted, 30. Reuben took 1 step forward. 50, he said, his voice deep, steady, cutting through the noise like thunder through dust. The square fell silent. Heads turned, mouths dropped. And in that breathless hush, something irreversible began. Time froze in the town square. Dozens of white faces turned to Reuben, stunned into silence. A black man placing a bid. The unspoken rules of Briar Hollow were shattering in real time. I won't sell my daughter to her, the father spat. $70, Reuben said firmly, pulling a cloth pouch from his coat. Gold coins gleamed in the sunlight as he laid them before the sheriff. Sheriff Denton hesitated, looking around nervously. Mr. Cassel, the law says any free man can place a bid, Reuben said without flinching, unless you'd prefer to explain to a federal judge why you refused the highest offer. The silence cracked like glass. Then bang, the sheriff slammed the gavel. Sold. Nora didn't move. But as Reuben approached, he took off his coat and gently draped it over her shoulders. She flinched not from fear, but from the unfamiliarity of gentleness. You're safe now, he whispered, not expecting a response. And then she looked up. Their eyes met, not with trust but with recognition. Of pain, of dignity, still intact. Reuben didn't purchase a person. He reclaimed a soul the world tried to discard. They walked away from the platform slowly, with the weight of the town pressing on their backs like iron chains. Whispers sliced through the air. Did he really just buy a white girl? They can't allow that. She won't last a week. Nora followed Reuben by half a step, out of instinct, not submission, like someone taught to disappear. As they passed the saloon, Jethro Mays spat at the ground. $70 for something you won't keep long. Cassel, he sneered loud enough for everyone to hear. Reuben didn't flinch. He said nothing, only offered his hand to help Nora onto the old wagon parked at the edge of town. She was trembling, not because of him, but because of what her past had taught her to expect. Pain, violence, ownership. Reuben saw it in her body language, the armor of a girl who had never known safety. I won't hurt you, he whispered, just for her ears. You have my word. Nora looked at him, really looked. His eyes were tired, weathered, but behind them burned a steady light she hadn't seen in years, understanding. Not pity, not desire, but a promise. The wagon creaked along the barren countryside. Fields lay cracked and thirsty. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile, more like a waiting room between past and future. Reuben kept his eyes forward and reined steady in his hands. Nora sat rigid beside him, every muscle in her body braced. Then softly she asked, why did you do it? He didn't answer right away. His jaw flexed, holding back years of grief. Because I buried my wife in that town, he thought. Because no white doctor would come. Because I know what it means to be called less than human. Finally, he said, because I know what it feels like to be treated like property. The wind stirred. Nora's fingers tightened around the hem of his coat, still draped over her. She didn't thank him. She didn't trust him, not yet. But for the first time, she didn't want to jump off the wagon either. As they approached his cabin on the edge of the oak grove, neither noticed the faint metallic sound from her boot. Hidden deep in her worn shoe, a tiny brass key pressed into her heel, and a shadow watched from the trees. Nora hadn't been rescued. She had a mission. The cabin stood quietly among the withered fields, stoic and still, like it had seen more loss than any home should. Reuben stepped down first. It's not much, he said, voice low, but it's mine, and no one will bother you here. Nora didn't move. Her eyes scanned the perimeter every angle. She wasn't just looking, she was calculating. Escape routes, hiding spots, lines of fire. When she finally climbed down, she kept a few steps of distance. Reuben noticed but said nothing. He opened the door and pointed down the hallway. There's a room in the back. It was my son's. It has a lock from the inside. Nora paused, surprised. Your son, Jacob, Reuben said. He and his mother died of pneumonia 2 winters ago. He was 5. No grief in his tone, only the numb echo of someone who'd told that story too many times. Inside the cabin was modest but meticulously kept. A small oil lamp burned on the center table already lit. Nora's eyes flicked to it. Someone had been here recently. She slipped her hand to her shoe, pressing the hidden key tighter into place. Reuben thought he'd saved a broken girl, but Nora was the storm coming. The cabin was silent except for the faint clinking of spoons against ceramic. Reuben had prepared a modest meal, bean stew and cornbread. He placed a bowl in front of Nora without a word and sat across the table, hands folded, waiting. For minutes they said nothing, just two survivors breathing in the same room, learning not to flinch. Then Reuben spoke. You're thinking about running tonight. Nora froze, her spoon stopped halfway to her mouth, trembled slightly in her grip. I don't blame you, he said gently, but there are men in the eastern woods, hired by the mayor, looking for someone, anyone who steps out of line. She met his eyes, guarded but curious. I'm not a slave, she said flatly. No, he agreed, but try explaining that to men who only see skin in the dark. His voice wasn't sharp, it wasn't threatening, it was simply true. Nora looked down again, but this time not out of submission, out of calculation. She hadn't expected kindness here. She certainly hadn't expected strategy. This wasn't a place of captivity. It was the edge of a battlefield. The next morning, Nora woke up early. The door wasn't locked. No chains, no guards, just morning light slipping through the curtains. She walked barefoot into the main room. Reuben was gone, probably out working the dying garden. But what caught her attention wasn't his absence, it was what he left behind. On the table sat an open book, Federal Civil Rights, annotated. Pages dog-eared, underlined with side notes, scribbled in tidy handwriting. Beside it, a bundle of worn letters, each signed by Professor H. Adler, Boston University. Nora's breath caught in her throat. She skimmed one. Your insights on land law are correct. Keep learning. One day you'll teach others to fight with words instead of fists. She stared at the words like they were foreign. Reuben Cassel wasn't just a farmer. He was a man who taught himself the laws meant to silence him. She sat in his chair, touched the ink still drying on the edge of a page, and for the first time she wondered, was she here to be saved? Or to join something far bigger than herself? Before she could answer that, she heard hooves. 3 riders, and one of them she knew far too well. Outside, 3 men rode slowly through the gate like they owned the dirt under their horses. Nora ducked behind the curtain and watched. Bert Delaney, the saloon owner, led the trio with his usual smirk. To his left, Clyde Roper, the brute, with hands like iron and a history of making examples. But the third, Everett Hale, wore a tailored suit and a politician's smile. A new face, but no stranger to power. Reuben didn't cower. He dropped his hoe and walked out to meet them. Mr. Cassel, Delaney said, feigning politeness. We're here on official business. This is Judge Hale, appointed by the county. Roper added, grinning. Hale tipped his hat with eyes that never blinked. We're inspecting land for suitability. The county's looking to reallocate unproductive areas. My taxes are paid, Reuben said plainly. It's not about taxes, Hale replied. It's about potential. Nora clenched the curtain. She knew the script. She'd heard her father rehearse it behind closed doors. They weren't here for Reuben's crops. They were here to make his land disappear. And maybe, him with it. When the men left, dust swirling in their wake, Reuben didn't say a word. He just returned to his garden, bent over a wilting vine like nothing had happened. Nora stood behind him, fists clenched. They want your land. He didn't look up. They always have. But why now, she pressed. It's nothing but drought and dust. Reuben finally met her eyes. Because there's something under this soil worth more than money. She hesitated, then reached into her pocket. I've been hiding this since I left. She handed him a folded slip of paper, her handwritten copy of entries from her father's red ledger. Names, dates, payouts. A map of the proposed railroad line cutting straight through black and immigrant-owned land. They were planning to sell me anyway, she whispered. I just knew too much. Reuben stared at the paper like it was a confession from God himself. He didn't ask how she got it. He didn't need to. Instead, he said quietly, then it's time we stop surviving and start remembering what our names are worth. That night, thunder rolled in across the plains. Wind howled like it remembered every injustice ever whispered in this town. But inside the cabin, there was only firelight and purpose. Reuben sat at the table pen, scratching against paper, forming sentences like armor. Nora watched him in silence, her body wrapped in a quilt, but her soul wide awake. He sealed the letter with trembling fingers and rose. Where are you going? She asked. To the telegraph office. Jenkins still owes me a favor. She stood too. Let me come with you. He hesitated, then nodded. Together they moved through the storm-cloaked figures against the dark. At the back door of the telegraph office, Lewis Jenkins opened without a word. He took one look at Reuben's face and stepped aside. The line to Boston's open, he said. Reuben handed him the letter. Make sure it reaches Professor Adler. Lightning flashed behind them. Nora turned toward it. In that split second of white light, she saw herself not as someone once sold, but as a torchbearer in the storm. And somewhere in the distance, a fuse had been lit. The next morning, Nora stood by the window, staring at the garden, as Reuben gently watered soil that refused to bloom. Who is Professor Adler? She asked softly. Reuben didn't look away from the parched earth. The only man who believed I could be more than the color of my skin. He set the watering can down. When I couldn't read, he sent books. When I couldn't write, he sent patience. And when I wanted to give up, he reminded me that knowledge is the one thing they can't confiscate. Nora swallowed hard. My father, he used to meet with Mayor Thorne, she said. They talked about reallocating unproductive land before the railroad deal went public. They needed to get rid of anyone who didn't fit the image. Reuben turned slowly, his face tightening. Who forged the documents? She hesitated, then whispered, Judge Hale. I saw him stamp them myself. There was no shock in Reuben's eyes, just confirmation of a truth he'd long suspected. From her coat, Nora pulled a scrap of paper, names, payments, dates painstakingly copied by hand from her father's red ledger. This is what they killed futures for, she whispered. And in that moment, two invisible people became witnesses. History couldn't ignore. That afternoon, a wagon rolled into the clearing. Dust billowed behind the wheels like smoke from a coming fire. It was Miriam Blake, the midwife and matriarch of the county's black community. Her frame was small, but her presence filled the yard before she even stepped down. I brought dried beans, corn seed, and news, she said, handing Reuben a sealed envelope. He accepted it without question. Miriam turned to Nora, her sharp gaze softening slightly. You're Whitman's girl. Nora nodded warily. I caught you once sneaking biscuits during your mama's delivery, Miriam said. You were 5, had dirt on your cheeks and questions in your eyes. Now it was Nora who softened. They've started, Miriam said, voice like flint. 3 black-owned farms seized in 48 hours. No hearings, no appeals. They say it's for restructuring, but we know what it is. Reuben opened the envelope. His hand stilled. Professor Adler has responded, he said. He's ready. Miriam's eyes met his. Then so must we be. Nora clenched the paper in her hand. I know where the original red book is. The real one. The one with signatures. And with that, truth finally had a plan and a direction. 3 nights later, beneath a moonless sky, Nora approached the Whitman estate like a shadow. Every corner of her childhood home creaked with memory, each floorboard echoing with the weight of what had been hidden here for years. She slipped through the servants' entrance. Her fingers knew the way better than her feet. In her father's office, the air was stale with tobacco and secrets. The cross still hung above the fireplace, pious, polished, and hollow. She slid it aside. Behind it, just like she remembered, was a safe. The numbers hadn't changed. Her mother's birthday. Click. Inside was the original red ledger, leather-bound, heavy with consequence. Pages filled with names, powerful names. Money trails, property transfers, a railroad map rerouted through stolen land. Nora pressed the book against her chest. It smelled like dust and betrayal. From a drawer, she took a bundle of blank county deeds pre-signed, ready to be assigned. Her father had prepared for total control, but tonight his daughter had come to burn his kingdom to the ground. She slipped back into the dark, clutching the truth like it might combust. And somewhere in the silence, a town's reckoning began to stir. By dawn, the town of Briar Hollow awoke to an unfamiliar sound, nails being driven into wood, not into flesh. On the church doors, courthouse steps, and the market board sheets of paper flapped in the wind like surrender flags from the powerful. Pages copied from the Red Book, each one listing the names of those who had bought silence, sold land, and buried the law beneath their boots. At the bottom of each sheet, NL Justice does not whisper. Reactions spread like a fever. Some tore down the pages only to find them posted again within the hour. Others gathered in disbelief, reading the names of men they shook hands with every Sunday. At 10 a.m., a train arrived unannounced. Stepping off were three men, a federal marshal, a representative from the Continental Railroad, and a journalist from the New York Sentinel. They didn't come for business. They came for truth. And the only person waiting for them at the platform was Reuben. When asked who posted the documents, he simply said, "Someone tired of being quiet." In the crowd, Nora stood behind the church pillars unseen. But her voice, it was on every wall. Later that afternoon, with the square filled and silence pressing against every breath, Nora stepped onto the same wooden platform where she'd once been sold. She wore a plain dress, no makeup, no script, only truth. "I was once priced at $70, she said, voice steady but raw. But the real cost of silence is much higher. People listened because they knew her face. They knew the bruise once blooming on her cheek. They remembered how she had been led away in a coat not her own. She held up the Red Book. "This contains your signatures, your plots, your lies." She pointed at Mayor Thorne, who tried to slink back into the crowd. "You sold me to shut me up. But what you didn't know was that I never needed to be loud to be heard." The federal marshal took the book from her hands reverently. Reuben climbed the steps, stood beside her, not as a protector, but as a witness. And for the first time in Briar Hollow, a girl once auctioned like cattle stood taller than any man in power. Because dignity once reclaimed does not bow. The courtroom was overflowing, not with defendants, but with spectators, journalists, elders, and workers who had once believed justice was a locked door. Judge Everett Hale adjusted his collar behind the bench, but even the oak gavel in his grip couldn't steady his hand. In front of him stood Nora and Reuben. Behind them, Miriam Lewis Jenkins and over a dozen witnesses from seized lands. The federal marshal set the Red Book on the evidence table with a heavy thud that echoed like a cannon. "Your Honor," said the prosecutor from Boston, "we ask that you recuse yourself immediately. This court has no place for the accused to sit as arbiter." Gasps rippled. Hale turned pale. "No proof," he muttered. But the marshal raised a second envelope, signed affidavits, and a sworn statement from Miss Nora Whitman typed and notarized under federal protection. Every eye turned to Nora. She didn't flinch. "You once tried to buy silence with power," she said, "but truth doesn't bargain." And in that moment, the gavel didn't fall, because even the law had grown afraid of the truth's weight. Outside the courthouse, under the sweltering sun, a line of women began to form. Old and young, scarred and proud, they stood shoulder to shoulder, some holding baskets, others holding babies, all holding stories the world had refused to write down. Miriam Blake stood at the front, her cane dug into the dirt like a flag. "These women lost husbands to this land," she told the reporters. "Lost sons to crooked jails and homes to lies on paper." A young journalist with ink-stained hands asked, "What do you want now?" Miriam's eyes burned through him. "We want names remembered, right? We want land returned. We want the truth carved into stone, not buried beneath it." Inside the courthouse, Judge Hale was removed from the bench. But outside, in the quiet power of that gathering, history was already rewriting itself. Nora stepped out onto the steps and saw it, not a protest, but a revival. Reuben joined her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "This is what $70 bought," he whispered. And Nora smiled through tears. "No," she said. "This is what your belief in me bought." 3 days passed. In that time, 2 county officials resigned. The railroad halted construction, and 6 land deeds were returned after the ledgers proved they were stolen. But something greater happened inside Reuben's home. Nora, once wary and guarded, now moved with quiet certainty. She read law books beside Reuben by firelight. She copied case files and drafted affidavits, her handwriting steady, deliberate. They were no longer two strangers forced into proximity. They were co-authors of change. One night as thunder rumbled, far off in the distance, Nora turned to Reuben. "You could have left me with those men. Saved yourself trouble." Reuben looked up, smile worn but warm. "I didn't save you." She blinked. "What?" "You came here with fire. I just made sure the wind didn't blow it out." Silence. Then a tear fell down Nora's cheek, not from pain, but from release. She had been held, branded silence, but never broken. And now beside a man who saw her, not as debt, but destiny, she finally felt something deeper than freedom. She felt belonging. 2 weeks later, the town of Briar Hollow unveiled a plaque in the square. It was simple. No gold, no politicians giving speeches, just bronze weathered and honest, in memory of those whose voices were once sold and in honor of those who refused to be silenced, dedicated to Nora Whitman and Reuben Cassel. Children touched the name with reverence. Elders wiped their eyes in silence. Nora stood back, heart pounding. She had not expected this. She didn't need her name cast in metal. But then she saw a little girl in a cotton dress whisper the names aloud. Like a prayer, like a promise. Reuben turned to her. "That's what survival looks like." Nora nodded, and that, she said, pointing at the crowd gathered in respectful quiet, is what rising looks like. For the first time in generations, the town square wasn't a place of shame. It was sacred, because it remembered the right names, and because no girl would ever again be priced at $70. Spring arrived like a hymn. Reuben's garden, once brittle and bare, bloomed with quiet defiance. Beans, tomatoes, collards, each leaf a whispered, "We're still here." Nora knelt beside the rose dirt under her nails, sun on her back. She was no longer a fugitive of silence. She was a planter of legacy. From Boston, a letter arrived. Professor Adler's handwriting trembled with age, but burned with pride. "I taught Reuben to read. He taught you to write the future. That is the miracle of resistance." Inside the envelope was a deed, signed and stamped official. Ownership of the Castle farm now transferred to both Reuben and Nora. Equal, partners, stewards. When Reuben saw it, his hand gripped hers. "This land is ours now," he said softly. She looked at the soil, then the sky. "No," she whispered, "it's theirs." And with that, she pressed the first seed of the season into the earth. Because the revolution wasn't in the courtroom. It was always in the garden, where hands once chained now planted, and voices once sold, now grew wild, unstoppable, and free. 3 weeks after the trial, a storm rolled in, one of those southern tempests that snapped tree limbs and rattled window panes like angry spirits. The power flickered. Rain hammered the tin roof. Yet inside the small farmhouse, Nora and Reuben sat at the kitchen table reading by lantern light. They weren't afraid. They had survived storms no weather could match. Suddenly, a knock at the door. A teenage boy stood on the porch, soaked to the bone, holding a wet envelope. I heard what you did," he stammered. "My grandmother says your land used to be ours, that it belonged to our family before Judge Hale." Reuben took the letter. Inside was a map, hand-drawn, with dates, names, and stories scribbled in the margins. "This storm won't last," Reuben said, smiling gently. "But when it's gone, we'll plant the truth deeper than they ever buried the lies." Nora nodded. "Because truth doesn't rot in the soil. It blooms when you have the courage to water it." A week later at the county fair, Nora spotted a little girl with a blue ribbon in her hair. The girl was standing alone, staring at a sign labeled "Whites Only Restroom." Her eyes were wide, confused. Nora knelt beside her. "Do you know why they put that sign up?" she asked. The girl shook her head. "Because once upon a time, people were afraid of sharing." Nora whispered, afraid that if others stood beside them, they'd be seen as equal. The girl tilted her head. "Is that bad?" "It is," Nora said, "when fear teaches you to forget someone else's heart." She took the ribbon from the girl's hair and gently tied it around the whites only signpost, and together they walked away. An hour later, a judge from Atlanta removed the sign himself, because a story had been shared, because a girl asked a question, because sometimes revolution starts not with fire, but with a ribbon, a whisper, and the courage to explain the truth to a child. The next morning, a courier arrived at Reuben's farm with a thick envelope bearing the seal of Boston College. It was addressed to Ms. Nora Whitman. Inside, a scholarship offer for full legal studies. A personal letter from Professor Adler. A note from the Massachusetts Bar Association promising mentorship. She stared at the parchment, her hands trembling. I never graduated, she whispered. I don't even have a high school diploma. Reuben smiled. You have something better. What proof that you already stood against injustice when most people stayed seated? Tears slid down her cheeks. For a girl who had once been bartered, abused, and ignored, this was more than education. It was a declaration. She didn't need saving. She needed room to rise. And now the world had opened its door not out of pity, but because she kicked it wide enough for others to follow. Behind Reuben's house stood a crooked oak tree, bent from wind, scarred by lightning, split down the middle, but it never fell. Miriam once said that tree was like Reuben, wounded, but rooted. On Nora's last night before leaving for Boston, she carved something into its bark, the girl who was sold and the man who believed. Reuben touched the letters and smiled. You sure you want to leave this place? Nora looked at the house, the porch swing, the dirt road, and then the stars. I'm not leaving it, she said. I'm taking it with me, every part of it. She hugged him long and hard, knowing she wouldn't just be writing laws. She'd be defending people like the woman she used to be and honoring the man who reminded her she was never less than priceless. The oak creaked above them like it was listening. And with that, she walked into her future not as a debt, not as a servant, but as a voice etched into the very bones of the land. Years passed. Reuben's farm became a sanctuary for the displaced. Miriam's grandchildren ran barefoot through fields that once held sorrow. The oak tree stood taller. And in Boston, Nora became attorney Nora Whitman Cassel, defender of the voiceless speaker of truth. One morning at a community event, a reporter asked her, how did all of this begin? She paused, smiled, and whispered, it began with $70. And a man who didn't buy me but believed in who I could become. The crowd went still, because this wasn't just a tale of money or land, it was a testimony, a reminder that sometimes the most broken beginnings grow into the most unshakable legacies. And that even if the world prices you at $70, your worth cannot be measured, only honored. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't start with war. They begin with kindness, truth, and the courage to stand when the world wants you silent. A voice that rises from pain can shake foundations. And when dignity is reclaimed, it becomes unstoppable.